So like I said in the intro, this was only going to be a two-part series, so this is the conclusion and starting where I left off, making sure that these containers fit inside of my frame. Like I said, I'm going to have plans available for this. I'm expecting to have them available at the exact same time as the upload for this second video. So if you want plans, I'll put a link in the description. But like I said, I don't think you need the plans in order to make this. I show all of my measurements throughout the build, but I know some people prefer to work off of plans. So before I glue this together, I'm going to go through and sand everything. I'm going to sand it to 120, and that's just because since there's varying dimensions of this, it's much easier to sand it while it's apart than when it's together. You could see looking at it, these are not perfect pieces of wood. They're not going to be from dimensional lumber with the way that I cut it. But like I keep emphasizing, and the reason why this is a perfect project for a beginner is that those problems that you encounter on more fine-tuned builds with exact dimensions are not going to be as critical for something like this. So you can see I marked my tenons with numbers just so that I could sand them. That was basically what that was, and then I could go through and glue this together. Now on bigger pieces of furniture, I would glue this together in pieces. The open time of the glue I like to use, which is Type Bond 3, is about 22-23 minutes, and especially in the heat of the summer, which it is now, the glue dries much faster. But this was small enough that I went through and I glued together one side, the other side, and then I ended up gluing together the whole piece. So gluing stuff together is one of the my least favorite tasks in the shop. Things that dry fit together perfectly sometimes have a tendency to go out of square when gluing stuff together. This is a one-person shop, so bigger glue ups can be a little stressful because you have to move quickly before the glue sets up. But this one was pretty small and I didn't have a lot of issues. You can see I'm just kind of going about it. Like I said, I glued together the two sides. I measure my diagonals to check for square. I find that is the most accurate way to do it. Once those two panels were square, you could see I put my short aprons and my short tenons in place, and then I can glue together the entire carcass. So like I keep emphasizing, squareness is very important, but on something like this, if this is a little out of square, it will affect the bottom slats. It won't really affect the top. The whole point of having an overhang on the top is to sometimes hide things that are off square. So I got it as close as possible. This was actually pretty much dead on, but once again, if you're new to this and it's off by 1/8 or so, you should be fine. So then to finish this up, I was going to put the bottom slats in place. Like I mentioned in the first video, it worked out that these offcuts I had from the 2x4s were perfect for that. So I just went through and set up a stop and cut a bunch of these. Obviously where the end is, I'm going to have to cut a smaller piece so it could fit in between the legs. So they're all the same size except for those two end pieces. I believe this is going to be outside, so spacing is important. You want water to be able to drain through this easily, leaves and all that stuff not to get stuck up in those parts. So I had this laid out, and I originally had quite a large overhang. I didn't particularly like it, so I set everything up and I adjusted the overhang. You could see the larger overhang on the left-hand side, which I didn't particularly like. And then I changed it so that the overhang was flush with the legs on the right-hand side. I preferred that, so I went back and recut all of my pieces. This is one of the reasons I like to build as I go. You cannot plan everything out ahead of time. Sometimes you see the way things fit together and you don't like them, and you can make changes. So that is what all of that looks like. And now I can go through and set up my spacing. It actually worked out perfectly that I had a 1/4 inch key stock, and that 1/4 inch spacing was just about perfect. There's a little bit of a wider gap on one end, but that is not going to be a big deal. If anything, it's going to be hidden by the containers on top. And then once again, I went through and sanded all this stuff before attaching it, especially with furniture for children, because they're going to be rubbing their hands all over this, and especially because it's not as nice of a grade lumber as other lumbers you can use. I went through and really sanded this stuff. I didn't want them getting any sort of splinters, getting their hands stuck on knots or anything like that. Sanding is always important. I feel like it's extra important when you're making stuff for children. And then it was just a process of gluing these in place. Now there's lots of ways to do this. This is going to be going outside, so this stuff is going to swell and contract quite a bit with the changes of the seasons. So what I did was I put some glue in place, I used my spacer to get all of my spacing accurately, and I put some brads in the top. I didn't want a bunch of visible hardware. And then on the underside, which you'll see in a later clip, I added some braces, and that is essentially what is going to keep everything from moving. This glue with the brad will most likely work fine without any issues, but stuff outside really needs to be built much more sturdy than it would stuff inside. The effects that woodworkers are constantly talking about with wood, like changes in humidity, sun and water, all that sort of stuff will affect wood tenfold compared to inside. So I had another piece of scrap. I just cut it into 3/4 by 3/4 strips. Once again, glued everything in place, and now I'll have 2 contact points on the bottom. I put brads in the bottom, and like I said, these should be fine. They shouldn't move. I don't love to put stuff like screws or large nails into outdoor furniture if I can avoid it. I know that's a popular thing to do, but that is a contact access point for water. Even if you're using exterior grade hardware, the water will find its way into that hole that you created because of the screw, and it will start rotting the wood at that contact point. Putting brads on the underside of something, water's never really going to touch that, and it shouldn't be an issue. So then for the top, I was working off of a photo, and I decided I wanted the top wider than the bottom. So I happened to have some 2x6s laying around the shop that I'd used for another project. They weren't as nice of a grade of lumber of Douglas fir, but they would work out for this project. So for the plans, that is a change I made because I had originally only bought 2x4s. For the top, you would need 2x6s. So the process for making this top is going to be identical. I'm going through and taking off these rough edges. This is older lumber that I actually had my lathe sitting on at one point, so some of it's rather beat up. I took those 2 sides off, and then once again I'm ripping this down to 1 inch. There's no reason for this to be an extremely bulky top. So, and it also essentially cleans up that one edge. I won't have to spend a lot of time sanding that one edge. The other edge will be the bottom side of the piece, so it's not as important if it doesn't clean up as nicely. And then I just rough laid out this top so I could get accurate measurements. I made sure that this piece fit in there. I wanted it to fit in there snugly. I wasn't going to add any sort of underside bracing or anything like that. This wood's strong enough to hold up the lip of that plastic container. So that's all I did. I set this up, I made marks, and I'm going to cut my long sides first. My long sides will have my mortises in them. So that's all I'm doing. I'm just cutting these down to size. And in the if you watch the first video, you know that I said I made all of my mortise and tenons with a mortising machine. I'm gearing this video towards DIYers, and I know most DIYers will not have a mortising machine. So this process going forward is cutting these with a hand drill. And before I got my drill press, that is how I cut them. Once I got my drill press, I started cutting them on my drill press, and then I made a mortising jig, which worked pretty well. But then once I got the mortising machine, that is really the best way to do it. It's the most accurate, but you can do it this way. This is a great project to practice on. So all I did was mark where I'm going to put my mortises. It's the same process. I marked in the center, 3/8 inch. I started using a regular drill bit, but it dances around quite a lot on you, so I switched over to a 3/8 inch drill bit. I put a piece of tape on the top, which is basically my depth stop, I'm just going to go along the piece and drill a series of consecutive holes going down. I like to map out my two ends first because those are the most important ones, and then I could go down through the middle. Now if you get too close to your other hole like I did here, the bit has a tendency to want to drop into that other hole, so your spacing should be a little bit wider than you would like, because that means you're going to have to remove that material. But I hadn't done this in quite a while, but once I got a hang of it after a couple holes, it's pretty easy. You want to drill these as vertical and square as possible, but if there is a little bit of undulation, I know I'm repeating record over here, but if this is the project to make mistakes on. So that's all that basically is, going through making a series of holes. Once I have my original set of holes, what I'm going to do is switch over to a regular 3/8 inch bit. You can see it's lined up on that mark really well. And then I'm just going to go through at an angle, and this bit is going to remove all of that excess material. You can see I'm shifting this from 90 degrees slowly to a 45, and that is going to help bore out the rest of that hole. So this is actually pretty easy work at this point. The drill bit's going to naturally want to align with the holes that you already drilled, because it's going to be the least amount of resistance. You can just go back and forth and essentially wiggle it until you remove all of that material. I will periodically take it out, remove the material, and then put it back in there to get all of that out. It's not the prettiest looking mortise, but it will get the job done for something like this. I can put this back in, and then once you get the bit going back and forth like this pretty smoothly, it's usually a good sign you've gotten all of that material out, and I can move on to the next one. So obviously a little bit longer of a practice. It's not going to be as accurate, but once again, very doable if you do not have a wide set of tools. And that's basically what that looks like. So I'm going to do this again, going through it pretty quickly. This is the same exact process. Start at one end, go to the other, make that series of holes, and then you could clean out all of that material. So this process will come into play because sometimes that mortising machine I have, I think it only goes to 4.5 inches. So there have been circumstances, even since I got that machine, where I have to use this process again in order to get this done. If you have a drill press, that usually comes out much cleaner. It will take longer than the mortising machine, and you are left with circular mortises, so you usually have to sand over your tenons, but it's also a nice process. And then once again, before I do my tenons, I'm going to cut one, test fit, make sure everything fits in there nicely. Everything's flush and square. I centered it quite well because there's no high or low spots, and I was pretty happy with that. These holes in there, like I said, were because this used to be a jig. I will plug those with dowels. I don't think I show that in the video. So then I marked on my boards how deep my tenons were. These were about 2 inches. I can measure in between those marks, and then I can cut my short sides. The short sides are obviously going to be that long length, and then I'm going to be adding a 2-inch tenon to either side. Exact same process as originally done. If you do not have a radial arm saw like I do, you could do this on the table saw, you could do this with a router, you can do this with a circular saw, but I would recommend having some sort of straight edge cutting mechanism attached to it, because it's going to be really hard to get a straight line on that one edge, and if it's not straight, you'll get gaps where the edge meets the legs. At this point, in this circumstance, the tabletop. But it's pretty simple. I already had this set up for my original pieces, so I didn't have to change it. I cut a series of kerfs. Pine usually chips off pretty easily, so I make my kerfs quite wide, and then I could just go through and clean that up, and then add my 2 shoulders. I believe on this one I did 3/4. On all the other ones were 5/8. Could go through and make my straight line marks and cut that material out. This will shrink the tenon a little bit. Right now it's 4.5, and that's kind of the edge of the range of how wide you want these. The smaller you make lumber, the smaller you make these joints, the less it's going to shift and change on you. So as soon as you get to about 4 inches or over, you want to start looking into doing a double tenon. That won't come into play for this piece, but that's usually the rough guideline that I use, is about 4 inches. And then this was a pretty simple glue up because this went together quite nicely. I'm just going to put an ample amount of glue on all of my tenons and put this in place and let that set up. So much easier glue up than the base. Make sure everything's square. Put some clamps on it. Like I said, the bottom side of this, I didn't pre-sand this because it was going to have a little bit, the pieces of this did not go together as nicely because all the mortises were done by hand. So I knew I was going to have to sand this, and the surface is flat, so it's much easier to sand something like this than the table base. That is what that looks like, and like I said, I could go through. There were some high parts from when I ripped this down on the table saw. I could sand all of that until it's nice and flush, and then start attaching all of these pieces. I built this over the course of probably a week or so because it wasn't necessarily time sensitive, but if I had to, I could easily make something like this in 2 afternoons. Make sure that everything fits. The 2 containers are a little bit snug, but everything fits. And then for the top, I'm going to chamfer the edges so there's no sharp edges on there. Pretty simple. I have a chamfering bit for my palm router, and I just went around the edge and chamfered. You could use a round over for this. I prefer the look of a chamfer. I do the bottom side as well and then sand that. So now all of the edges, round over the edges, are not super square and sharp. Shouldn't have to worry about scraping against them or getting splinters or anything like that. It also gives it a nice finished look on top of being a little bit safer and user-friendly. Now for attaching this, usually I don't attach this the way that I decided to attach this, which is pocket hole screws. The reason I decided to do pocket hole screws was because it was the easiest way to do it. I didn't have a lot of space on the underside for hardware because the Tupperware container's in the way. And the other reason is because that this frame sits right on the edges of the board. Your wood is going to move across the grain, not the length of the grain. So the fact that this will be pinned in place on my edges will mean that it's the least likely to split because it still has room to move towards the one edge. If you put this in the middle of the board, that's sometimes where you have problems because as this moves, it wants to expand. So like I'm pointing out here, it's going to expand across this piece. And I only put 2 pocket hole screws in there. They weren't super snug, so I don't think I'm going to have a problem with this. But I do want to point out that for a tabletop of a table, of a side table, anything like that, especially with a solid piece, pocket hole screws are not what I would use to attach it. And I don't put any on the edges as well. It's just, I think I have 5 holes, but I think I only ended up putting 3 on these 2 sides. And like I said, I'm not super worried about this wood cracking because it still has room to move to one side. It's when you pin it in place that you start to run into problems. That's what that looks like. And then I had sent the customer pictures as I was building this. We originally talked about putting an exterior stain on there with a color, but she really liked how it looked. And I explained to her that there's not a lot of finishes you could put on stuff that will keep the natural look of wood. Everything will change the color slightly. So I put some Thompson's clear coat on there. I've never used Thompson's before, but I've always heard good stuff about it. It's the least expensive. It's something they can easily go out and buy and reapply a couple years from now if they have to. And it really brought out the nice color of the finish. So the top there, you can see I didn't film it, but I plugged those couple of holes with some dowels. And this stuff, it's one coat. You let it dry. You don't want to put it on too thick. A lot of people are complaining about it never drying, but that's usually a sign of it being applied too thickly. You want this to be able to absorb in the wood, and that's basically it.